Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Heather Gregg, who is a professor at the U.S. Army War College's Strategic Studies Institute. From 2006 to 2019, she was an associate professor at the Naval Postgraduate School's Department of Defense Analysis, where she worked primarily with Special Operations Forces. Prior to joining the Naval Postgraduate School, she was an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation. In addition to her academic experience, she has spent time in several regions of conflict, including Palestine and the West Bank and the former Yugoslavia. And I'd like to mention at the top here that Dr. Gregg's opinions are her own and do not represent the opinions of the U.S. Army War College or the Department of Defense, and she has no special access to intelligence or any operational matters that are not otherwise available to the general public. Heather Gregg, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
The conversation I'd like to have with you today, Heather, will cover identity and myth, especially as it relates to insurgency and counterinsurgency. And in preparation for this discussion, you shared with me, and I read one of your articles entitled Identity Wars, Collective Identity Building in Insurgency and Counterinsurgency. And we'll have a link to this and other resources that we mention in the show notes. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape?
Yeah, so I think we're in an age of influence now. And I think that now more than ever, we need to think about how we influence key actors. And this includes things like leaders, governments, militaries, and even critical populations. And I think we have a range of tools through which we can influence, right? So we can influence through our militaries, through coercion, through deterrence and compellence. We can use brute force, which takes the choice away from the target. But I think as importantly, maybe even more importantly now, we need to think about how to influence through means other than the use of force. So this would include things like economics and information. And then within all of this, we need to think about how we attract. So how we use soft power to build relationships and attract allies and partners. So within all of this, relationships matters tremendously in the age of influence. So our allies are no longer an accessory. Maybe they never were, but more now than ever, we need to think of them truly as partners. We need to think about how they help us and how we can help them. And then within all of this, I think it's important to look at our adversaries. Our adversaries are really good at influencing right now. And they're using a complex mixture of sticks and carrots, incentives and coercion, and including things like economics and information. They're using information very well, but I think as of late, we're seeing that there might be some chinks in the armor. There might be some opportunities for us with regard to information. And hopefully we'll come back to that. I think they're also very good at using what we might consider non-traditional battle spaces. So they're using cyber very effectively, but they're also waging wars through critical populations and through perceptions. This is what I call population-centric warfare. I think the strategic environment gets even more complicated because we're dealing both with state and non-state actors. We're dealing with proxy forces, a range of different actors that makes our response more complicated. Within all of this, I would say that state and non-state actors are willing to fight and die for things other than material interests. They're willing to fight and die for ideas, for identity, which we're going to talk about. And then finally, within all of this, the idea of victory is very elusive. We need to rethink why we go to war. We need to think how we measure success, because war is being fought on so many planes. So we're in a really complicated strategic environment, and things are moving very quickly.
Yeah. So identity. Identity is a big topic. It's one of those words that is used a lot as if people understand it. Like when I talk about myself, I think I know what I'm talking about. But in the world of philosophy, or in your area of expertise, Heather, it's really easy to smuggle in a whole bunch of erroneous concepts about what it means to be human. So what do you mean by identity? And then perhaps we can get into how collective identities are constructed, what they include, and how they shape human behavior. Could you take that in whatever direction you think is productive?
Sure. Yeah. I think what's fascinating about the study of identity is that there are multiple academic disciplines that look at this. And depending on the academic discipline, you're going to get a different definition. So, as you mentioned, I'm particularly interested in collective identity building. And I'm especially interested in the dynamic between how identities are held by the group, but how they deeply influence individuals, and then individuals in turn affect that collective identity. And then within all that, how the environment outside the group shapes the identity as well, and in turn, how that group can shape the environment. So there's these very interesting circular dynamics occurring between the individual, the group, and the wider context in which they reside. So that's fascinating to me, and I'm really interested in things ranging from terrorist cells, how they form identities, but also even at the societal and the national levels. Interestingly enough, as you mentioned, with the human aspect, there's biological evidence that identity plays a hugely important role to humans biologically. It tells us who the group is that we're a part of, that is going to defend and feed us and care for us. But then also there's this fascinating dynamic, because it also tells us the group we're not a part of, and possibly the group we need to be wary of or defend against. And it's under times of conflict, violent conflict, and war, that I think collective identities take on this really powerful component, where they start to calcify, and this biological need to say, who am I a part of, and as importantly, who am I not a part of? Who's going to protect me? Who should I be protected from? Starts to ramp up. And so that's the piece I'm particularly interested in, are these dynamics, more so than a concrete definition of identity.
I see. I was listening to another podcast here recently, and the person who was talking about culture and identity as well was making a distinction between what he called like horizontal cultural diffusion and vertical cultural diffusion. And I'm curious whether that is something that you have come across, or that you've studied. And I think what he meant by vertical cultural, I'm going to use the word identity, but vertical cultural influence or norms are things that are passed along generationally, and they tend to be like longer lasting or have like more resilience. But horizontal cultural interactions tend to be very fast acting and might not have the same staying power, although these things, these forces mix together in complex ways, which definitely need to be grappled with. Oh, yeah, and that this is something that we are witnessing or experiencing more than ever because of things like technology and social media. Does any of that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. There's another way that vertical identities are measured, because I study religion. There's also this idea that if you can link identity to the supernatural, to ideas of salvation on this earth and what comes after this life, that's a very powerful vertical integration of identity that's also very interesting. But I think your guest is talking about the temporal aspects, right? So and this is deeply, I think he's right on. This is deeply important. Most identities claim to be immortal in some way. Like they connect back to the very distant past. Powerful identities do this. And I think that this is something to watch when you see this kind of almost primordial identity being hearkened back to. This is saying, this is who we are, this is how we've always been, this is who we're going to be. And this gets into myths, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I think that's deeply important. But then you also have this very interesting phenomenon that your colleague mentioned, which is that through information technology, you can have just this widespread, and you can have these identities built very quickly across time and space, people that never meet each other. And I think the big question in academia still is, how durable are those identities? And so they can serve to galvanize people in the short run, but do they have the staying power of the vertically integrated identities across time? And then how do they work together, and do they work at odds, and under what conditions? That's a very interesting part of literature right now that I think is being explored through a number of different academic disciplines. So really work.
Right. And you were talking about religion and, like long-term, and many religions, I think, long-term, they're talking like eternity or forever, or, getting into heaven. But these types of religious, gosh, what's the right word? It's goals, I guess. It's like it tries to influence behavior today in order to have a reward later. And something I think that religions are running into today, which is a challenge, is that science is debunking some of the concrete, like literal interpretations of what is the reward in the afterlife. And I'm sure that is playing a role in the big complex systems mix that we've got going on right now. Would you say that any of that is fair?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting to me, and then this gets into the whole discussion of myths, is that, and so maybe we could go in that direction.
Sure. Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me about myths, and I know you're a fan of the study of myths, which is great. I think unlike identity, myths needs a definition, because the common understanding of the word myth is it's synonymous with lie. Yeah. And so this idea that it's factual and you prove it or you disprove it. And while I think it's important to address things that are false, and when we talk about national myths, certainly the United States is going through this, and other countries, we're constantly having to address our past and address these stories we've told ourselves and each other, and to reconsider those. So I think that is very important. But myths are deeply powerful to me, because I would define myths as a form of storytelling. And I know I listened to the podcast recently from Ajit Maan, that you had a few weeks ago. And so, she talks about storytelling and narratives. I think this is deeply important, but myths are a particular type of story. And I think they're really powerful because they tell us 3 or 4 things, right? They tell us who we are by telling us where we came from. So this is the origin story, the history. This is the vertical piece, is very important with identity. So where we came from, who we belong to, right? Who we belong to, and then how we ought to behave. And I think that all of these things, it's a story that packages all of these things at once. And I think this is deeply powerful. Karen Armstrong, who is a religious historian, calls this an early form of psychology. It gives us context in the world. It assigns meaning to things that we can't necessarily assign meaning to, and it motivates behavior. So it gives us a sense of belonging and identity, but it also motivates behavior. So myths are extremely powerful that way. And what's fascinating to me is when I teach this in the classroom, at first students are very resistant to this idea, because they're like, we don't, I'm a person of science. I don't delve in myths. And I think myths exist alongside science. And when they're confused as being facts, that's when it gets very problematic. But it seems to me that myth making and myth telling is a universal phenomenon. We see this. I start off as an anthropology major in my undergrad, and we see this across time and space, that there are these powerful stories that tell us who we are, where we came from, who we belong to, and how we ought to behave. And so, you know, I think it's a deeply powerful teaching tool. It's a storytelling tool. And in times of war and violent conflict, I think these take on particular importance.
In your experience or in your research, do myths have to be true, or do myths like start off maybe with a kernel of truth? And also, how does poetry or imagery or, you know, things that are sprinkled into myths help cement the meaning for the audience or for the community or society that you know, resonates with the myth? Do you get what I'm asking there?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best myths have a kernel of truth in them. So they're rooted in something historical that actually happened, an event or an individual. But that's where the truth of it sort of ends, because again, this isn't about it's presented like it's telling a factual story, but it's really not. And so I was trying to think of an example to give you before today that I think kind of starts to illuminate what myths are and how they work. And so the one I came up with was the idea of the city on the hill and a light unto nations, which is a fascinating American myth. So, and this is just loaded with all sorts of imagery and symbology and religion and different things of that nature. So when I lived in Boston, I lived on Beacon Hill. And Beacon Hill is actually a hill, but you can't really see it anymore because of the skyline. But if you see old pictures of Boston, it's a hill. And it considers itself the first neighborhood in the United States. Highly debatable, but that's the narrative, right? That's the myth.
That's their
right.
myth. Okay, got it.
That's their myth, right? And
Yeah.
and I was very excited to live in the first neighborhood in the United States. It's called Beacon Hill because it is hearkening back to this religious passage about being a light unto the nation. So that the beacon piece of this, which harkens back to the story we tell ourselves about the founding fathers, our founding fathers and mothers in the United States that landed on Plymouth Rock, and the Pilgrims and that whole story, that were seeking, that were being religiously persecuted. They sought religious freedom. This is one of the foundational pillars of our country. And so all of these images are kind of woven into this idea of Beacon Hill. And it's just fascinating. I don't know if you've read the book Lies My Teacher Told Me, but this is Lowen is I think you would love it. It's Lowen, Lowen is the author. And basically he's looking at how we've somehow mixed up our myths with our history. And if you want to tell myths, that's an important part of kind of being human, but don't call it history because that's dangerous. And so, you know, he talks about how actually our founding fathers, there was already a colony in Virginia that predated Plymouth, right? But they didn't come for religious persecution. They came for wealth. They came to look for gold and to get rich. And there was a whole bunch of different motivations that didn't make a great story about our founding fathers and mothers. It didn't have the same ring to it. And then if you think about the light unto the nations, the city on the hill, this is something that I think even we still today take seriously as a country and a nation, where we believe I think on some levels, this might be changing, that it's our job to enlighten the world and to make it to build democracies, to promote enlightenment, and this is a story that I think if it runs like software in the back of our heads, but when we stop and think about it, it's kind of bizarre. So
Yeah.
these are the things that are just really fascinating to me about myths.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I could go on and talk to you about this kind of stuff, but let's hit your article here. And so everything that we've been talking about is a bit of a backdrop to this next phase of our discussion. So in your article, again, link in the show notes, you draw a contrast between the way identity is used by insurgents and by those who are engaging in counterinsurgency efforts. So, for example, in Afghanistan, the Taliban or Al Qaeda, who the West or who the United States and NATO forces have been engaged with, and the NATO conducting counterinsurgency efforts. You're seeing a distinction there. So, what are some of these observations related to identity?
Right. So one of the things I wrote a book called Building the Nation, Missed Opportunities in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the article is based off of the book. But one of the things I noticed when I was looking at insurgencies and looking at groups that use terrorism and insurgents was one of the first things I looked at outside of graduate school. And I was really surprised by how much energy they put into building identities. So describing, who they are, where they come from, what their sense of purpose is, trying to use that for indoctrination, recruitment, to motivate behavior. And I was just really surprised by how important this was to insurgents to create a sense of collective identity. And then by contrast, in US and different countries, coalition forces led efforts to state build in both Iraq and Afghanistan, identity was not something that was thought about much. It doesn't really come up, right? So there was a focus on building security forces and building the structure of the state and providing public goods and services, which are very important things. But there was no discussion about how do these people see a common identity with one another and a common destiny. And I think this was something that we missed. And I'll talk a little bit in a second about this. I don't think we should be building the collective identity, but we should be providing the context or providing the opportunity in which they can build it. But without building it, I think insurgents were doing a very good job offering a counter identity, particularly in Iraq was what I was looking at with AQ and the forerunner to ISIS. And we didn't counter that. So we took measures to disassemble Sunni identity, the Ba'ath Party. Some of our earliest activities were de-Baathification, both politically, and we disbanded the military, which was one of the oldest institutions in Iraq. And we didn't provide anything in that space. And so that provided an opportunity for insurgents to step in and offer a counter identity.
Do you have any thoughts on how insurgencies build identity? Do you think it's a conscious thing or an emergent thing, or perhaps a combination? What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I think there is a degree of consciousness there that insurgents are sort of like venture capital firms, right? They have to go out and sort of sell their ideas. They have to recruit supporters on different levels, highly committed to passively committed. And I think trying to get that narrative right is deeply important for their own success. And I think within that, identity becomes one of the key components. And one of the things that fascinated me about looking at the Sunni insurgencies, in particular in Iraq, was that they had a really nice, complicated, but very persuasive mixture of what they were fighting against and what they were fighting for. So if you know the counterinsurgent scholar David Galula, he talks about how it's easy to fight against something. It's harder to fight for something. You can get more people to fight against something than you can for something. And if you think about it, it's kind of a puzzling thing, but if you think about it, I think it sort of implicitly makes sense. So the Sunni insurgents had three broad enemies they were able to identify. The first was US and coalition forces. They used a mixture of a nationalist and religious argument for fighting them, everything from infidels being on their soil to, this is Iraq is ours, it's not theirs. So having a really rich narrative there that would appeal to a broad spectrum of people, including people that may not be religious at all, but that felt a strong connection to defending Iraq as their country. They also fought the coalition government, or the government rather, that was first the coalition government and then the government that was stood up as being a puppet of the United States and the West. And then they had a very strong anti-Shia message, which goes way back. So talking about vertical integration again, this narrative that Sunnis and Shias have never gotten along, it's actually not correct. It's not a historically correct argument, but it's very persuasive. And so then within that counter narrative of, here's, or that negative, like, here's what we're fighting against, they also came up with here's what we're fighting for, that sort of mirrored what they were fighting against. So they talked about the need to create a counter government. So whether initially it was some sort of separate state, as AQI decided to promote, or it was the caliphate later with ISIS, and the need to purify, to make the country both Sunni and Arab. So there was again both what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. And this reminds me a lot of the need to have enemies and allies. Okay, so you're nodding your head. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I'm also getting like some kind of like it's not exactly the same, but it's in the same zip code as social media engagement, stuff that is polarizing or inflammatory or I don't know, negative, tends to get more engagement, and it's almost like that. Like I said, it seems related. It's part of human nature to rally or to engage in something against rather than something for.
Yeah, and it draws these really powerful battle lines. Like, this is who I am, and this is who I'm not, and this is what I need to defend, and this is who's threatening me and threatening my identity and what I need to defend. So I think these collective identity constructions become very powerful in times of conflict. They shape conflict, but in turn are shaped by conflict. So there's this fascinating circular logic that occurs, and it's really powerful.
Right, and I'm almost hearing almost kind of like a 1-2 punch, or like first this and then that. It's like first there's an identity rallying against something, and then once you get some momentum, you can start integrating or weaving in, and this is the stuff that we're for, and so it becomes more cohesive or something with that 1-2. But you lead with the negative, or I keep on saying the negative, but you lead with what we're against. And I mean, this actually kind of takes me on to the next question that I wanted to ask you. And so, getting into the Ukraine war, does it surprise you that the West in general appears, at least in the short run here, appears to have galvanized so strongly against what Russia has done? And so all of these countries in Europe, there's been all kinds of strife and bickering, everything from what to do about the European Union. That's been very fraught. What about Brexit? What about what to do about oil and all? I mean, there's been all kinds of discord in the West, but all of a sudden, this Russian invasion happens, and all of a sudden it's been a very unifying thing, at least in the short run. What's your hot take on all that?
Yeah, I think you're right. Honestly, it was a little surprising to me, the extent to which this has occurred, and has occurred so strongly. I saw an article recently that said something to the effect of like there's a flag making company in Texas that's they're selling more Ukrainian flags than American flags right now. And so it's not just governments that have galvanized against Russia's aggression. It's people as well. And seeing, I mean, I drive through my town and I see Ukrainian flags flying, and I'm not sure those are Ukrainian Americans. They might be, but but I have a feeling they're not. And so, you know, this has been a really powerful moment, and I think it shows that again, that the need to have enemies. It's something that right now that we can agree, I think, as the West, who our enemy is, and that can be very unifying. And
right,
so,
and back to your point about, you know, being against something.
Yeah,
it's a galvanizing thing. With that first step is we are against Russia and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian people. I would imagine, I'm speculating here, armchair quarterbacking, but you know, they're fighting for, you know, well, are they fighting for their country, or are they fighting against the invasion? I guess, you know, based upon your research, you might say, well, first they're fighting against Russia, and then maybe there's going to be this, and we're fighting for Ukraine. So,
right. And I think one of the things that's been very interesting to watch is how identity has played into the construction of the Ukrainian narrative, right? So I found it fascinating that Zelensky has been going around to European countries, to the United States. He spoke to our Congress. He spoke to British Parliament. I think he spoke to the Danish Parliament. And he's been all over the place, making this argument that we are Europeans. So he's making a identity argument for why we should be providing a variety of resources to Ukraine. And I think that's fascinating when you think about it. So this is not a pragmatic argument in the sense of, you know, if you don't stop Russia at our border, they might come to yours. It's I mean, there's a bit of that too, but he's really stressing the fact that Ukrainians are Europeans, just like the rest of Europe. So that's fascinating.
Right. Have you seen this video? I'll put a link to it in the show notes, but this video went around LinkedIn a few days ago. By the way, we're recording this on April 13th, 2022. So this is about 6 weeks into the Russian invasion of Ukraine or so. But this video went around that has presumably a Ukrainian woman. She's got this beautiful headdress on that's like with white and red and black roses, and it's in Ukrainian, but she's talking about how Russia has woken a sleeping giant, or we're a peaceful agricultural society, but we have, part of us is in the soil and the blood of Ukraine, and you've woken this, and then she picks up like a sickle, right? And have you seen this?
I haven't seen it. No.
Yeah, I'll have to send it to you. She lifts. And her face is all battered and bloodied and bruised, and she's talking about geographic landmarks within Ukraine, like from the beautiful cliffs of here in Ukraine to the beautiful fields here. We will not take this, and she lifts a sickle up in her hand, and she drops it down, and you hear the sickle like make a slashing noise, and then it pans out, and she's slashed the throat of presumably a Russian invader, and the person is like flopping around as she finishes up and everything. It's a stunning video, and it's only about a minute long, but I think that kind of thing can be very galvanizing.
And very visceral. Yeah.
Wow. And the imagery, she's got like a long white gown on, and
wow.
like this headdress is quite striking. I should have sent this to you in advance so you could have commented on it, but we'll put this in the show notes. This has been a fantastic discussion, Heather. I've a couple last questions. So you have the opportunity to engage with lots of students, people who are going to be the next generation of leaders in the U.S. Armed Forces. But when you communicate with senior personnel in our national security establishment, what are the takeaways that you try to leave them with when it comes to identity?
Yeah, I think the thing I stress in the classroom is that pay attention to things like identity, like narratives, like myths. Know what myths are, ideas. It's can be frustrating to think about these things because oftentimes they are spoken in code and they don't necessarily make sense to us. But these are deeply important components of war, and they're deeply important for unit cohesion, for national cohesion. And listen and pay attention to these stories that people are telling you. And I think that is even more important today than it is possibly historically, that the stories that are being formed, not just as Ukraine continues to fight or as Europe continues to support Ukraine, but also what are the stories Russia is telling itself? What are the stories they're trying to tell other people? Why is it that those stories, are those stories resonating with their population? Why do they seem so wildly different from our own? I know this was the thing I thought about quite a bit with AQ and ISIS in particular, was this idea that we thought of them as criminals, as deviants, as butchers, and we used all this language, which, I'm not saying that's wrong because the things they did were outrageous, but what's the internal story of why they're doing these things? And
there's probably some kind of an internal logic for the way that they view the world. Yeah.
Right. And getting inside that logic can help us then understand, how do we start to pull that apart? How do we start to dismantle that narrative? And I think, and the myths and everything that goes along with it, the symbols. And so dismissing our adversaries as crazy or as deranged doesn't help us get inside these identities and these stories. So pay attention to them and try to understand them on their own terms.
Right. We've already mentioned your article, and we'll have a link to your book as well, Heather. But what's another good book or resource that you might share with our audience about the kinds of things that we're talking about today?
Yeah, so I think you've mentioned this as well, but I'm a huge fan of Joseph Conrad's work. The Power of Myth
Joseph,
did I say
Joseph Campbell?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Not
Heart of Darkness. Joseph Campbell, thank you.
I do it all the time.
That's hilarious. That's almost a Freudian, isn't it?
Yeah.
Probably is. I'm a big fan of Joseph Campbell's Power of Myth. Karen Armstrong's short introduction to myth, I think, gives a really nice discussion. The first section talks about what myths are. So Scott Attrand, who is a French American scholar, or maybe he's Quebecois, I forget actually, but in 2015, he addressed the UN Security Council on youth and extremism. This is a short piece that's available online, and that was for me a revelation to read this, where he talked about the need. It was all about the need for identity and belonging. And he said, we're paying too much attention to these grandiose ideas. At the end of the day, people want to feel like they belong to a group or a tribe, as we often overuse that term. I think that piece really changed my thinking and was really important. And then a little bit of an older piece, but again, Vomnik Volker's The Need to Have Enemies and Allies, ironically written about US and Soviet relations in 1985. He's considered one of the fathers of political psychology. So again, this idea of how political ideas shape groups and identity, just a really interesting read. And that came from the journal Political Psychology. He also wrote a book on that. But these are some things I would recommend. They're just really interesting reads. And I would also recommend Ajit Nan's podcast that you did a few weeks ago, just really interesting discussion. Her stuff on narratives has been very important to me. So I'm grateful that it was just great to come on your website and see that there and to get to catch up on what she's been thinking about.
All right, absolutely. Well, we will have links to these books and other resources and to that previous podcast that Heather just mentioned. And with that, you have given us a lot to think about. And with that, Dr. Heather Gregg, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks so much, John. It was a lot of fun.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.